Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and very welcome to this open forum session. And my name is Ines Steffens. I'm the editor of Eurosurveillance and an employee of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control in Stockholm. The opinions here are my personal opinions, and they're not the opinions of the Centre. I have no conflict of interest to declare. The idea for this session was born a year ago when John McConnell, the editor of Lancet Infectious Disease, and myself, we had a discussion about a development that we saw and that was making us a bit worried on attacks against scientists increasing over the time of the pandemic. So we felt this is something that we would like to bring to the attention of a broader audience, and actually we have seen this has created quite some attention ever since then. And today I want to pay tribute to John McConnell because he sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago, but I would like to pay tribute to his contribution to the idea of this session. So this session is happening at a point in time when we are 2 and nearly a half year into the pandemic. And this pandemic, and we've heard this ever so often, had a tremendous effect on our personal lives, but also on the lives of those who work in infectious diseases in all areas, and be it as researchers or be it as epidemiologists or public health experts. And you are normally used to work in your labs, in your offices, quenching data and communicating on occasions like this one at conferences with your peers. However, you're less used, or many researchers are less used to talk to a broad public. And this has been the situation in which you have been thrusted throughout the pandemic. People and the general public expected you to explain science in an evolving situation and to also provide the evidence on measures that needed to be taken, and that had a far-fetching influence on the lives of each and every one. And in this climate, being in the spotlight meant that there was a lot of praise. There was attention for jobs that hadn't had attention before. Everybody now knows how to say epidemiologist, and they know that numbers can be super sexy and interesting, when before they may have thought this is a very boring job to do. But along with the praise and along with becoming rock stars like Isabella Eckele framed it yesterday in her talk, there came also criticisms. And some of this criticism was, of course, the criticism to which everyone is known, and which is good criticism, because you need to scrutinize data, you need to scrutinize findings, and you need to discuss these in an open and trusted environment. However, there were all of a sudden attacks. There were threats, even physical threats, harassment, and the threats didn't stop at persons, but the threats even went wider and included family members of prominent scientists. So this is obviously an unacceptable situation. And what is the intention behind that, and what is the risk? The risk, of course, is intimidation. The risk is silencing, and silencing the voice of science obviously has a societal impact. So today we have 3 speakers who have kindly agreed to share their experiences in communicating in various roles during the pandemic. And the first speaker I would like to call to the floor is Anders Tegnell from Sweden. He has led the response in Sweden to the pandemic over 2 years, and he's become synonymous with the Swedish way, but we don't talk about the Swedish way today. Anders will share his experiences when communicating, and he recently stepped down as state's epidemiologist. He still works for the Folkhälsomyndigheten, which is the Swedish National Public Health Institute, and he leads the international engagement and projects of the center. So Anders, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to, I think, this very important and very interesting subject and seminar. It is a seminar with many, I think, levels included in it, and I'm going to start with saying something about the context in Sweden, because I think it's important to understand your context, to understand the controversy that you shape. And in Sweden, this was not so much of a political thing, at least not in the beginning. Now Sweden is the middle of an election year, so now it's completely different. But it was definitely extremely polarized, and I'm going to give you a few backgrounds to that. Because in the beginning it was even a peacemaking process among politicians in Sweden, which is interesting. We even have a special Swedish word for the peace that's shaped by crisis. I'll come back to that later. So to understand the context, you need to understand that we are a public health agency with a very wide mandate. We work with basically everything from snuff to Ebola, my old director used to say. And I think that's important to understand, because that gives us a basis to work on, which broadens our basis. And I think that's also, to a certain extent, created a controversy, because we were not then really only the communicable disease experts anymore. We were the public health experts, and that created both confusion but also a lot of controversy on what should be prioritized in this word. So this is just giving you some ideas of all the different areas that we work in. And you also need to understand that even if this was controversial in Sweden, especially controversial in media, it was not very controversial when it came to the public. And I think that's important to have with you, because I think that's, at least for me as a person, that was very important to understand, that even if the media played out and even if experts came and told we did a lousy job, when we asked the public was actually very happy. The public gave us a lot of support, and I think that's something to remember when you end up in this position, that there is always different stories out there, and of course it's the public in the end who is the important story, and they are the ones carrying the story. And the public trust was enormous, and the willingness to follow the recommendations we gave was also very, very high. So I think that's was very important to me personally, to have that background with me. And the other context is the political context. This is unfortunately in Sweden, I realize now. But the way we organize things in Sweden is slightly different than for many other countries. In many countries, the ministries have a direct role in taking decisions, even on a fairly detailed level. In Sweden, it does not work like that. The ministry works together with the agencies, and the agencies takes most decision on detail level. The ministry gives us the mandate to take decisions. They take the overall, of course, political decisions are done there, but then how they should be interpreted and how they should be run, that's done by the agency. And of course, once again, that created a kind of controversy, because then many of experts thought they should also be involved, and they couldn't really talk to the politicians and tell them what should be done. And they really all of them didn't find a way into the agency to talk to us either. So I think that's also important in the context to understand. Because being a civil servant in Sweden, once again I apologize because this is a word kind of thing that's only can be done in Sweden, but it's to show you how important it is to be a civil servant in Sweden, how a lot of responsibility it takes, how the trust for civil servants are very important to maintain. And I think that's very much also behind that we could feel, even in the middle of this controversy, as an agency, as persons working there, we could feel fairly safe, because we know we had this enormous trust behind us from the population. And we need to know also what does the political level really, what's their aim with public health as a whole, so we don't forget that. And in Sweden it's very much about the whole population should have possibilities to have a good health and to minimize these gaps that we see in most of our populations. And that was also very much in the back of our head all the time. And to realize that we actually worked towards the political goals that were there. But of course, pandemic management is always a balance, and there is always people that put different weights to different parts of this balance. And the lack of knowledge, of course, everybody knows, but we also need to think about other health problems. I heard the first question at the seminar that Marion was sharing, and I think that's something that many of us missed, how important it is also think about the broader aspects of a pandemic. But to finalize my small introduction, because I'm really looking forward to the questions from the public. anyway you can end up in big problems. This is a picture from one of the early press conferences, and this created a havoc in media because I had not really still in the back of my head how you're supposed to sneeze when you're in the middle of a pandemic. And the media loved this. And I'm usually a fairly patient person, but this a little bit got beyond what I could think was acceptable. And I was trying to tell media, we're not talking about my sneezing habits, we're actually talking about how to handle a pandemic, don't forget that. But it went on, and it ended up that my director actually went out into the media and told them, okay, now you need to step down. We need to focus on what's important. And actually, the next day, our agency was filled with flowers. And I don't know what about in other countries, but agencies don't normally get flowers from the population. That is not happening. But we got hundreds of bunches of flowers from everybody. And once again, I think when you are in the middle of this crisis and when you are in the middle of this wind blowing, think about the real target for your work. And if they are with you, I think you're usually safe. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Anders. The idea for this session is that we will have the 3 talks because they are complementary, and then we will take questions from the audience afterwards. So the next speaker is Marion Koopmans, Professor Marion Koopmans, and I think most of you and probably everyone will know her. She's a world-leading virologist who's worked all her life on the human-animal interface. She's the head of the viral science department at Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, and she has worked as a public health microbiologist. This maybe not so many people know, because she's been working at the Dutch Institute of Public Health, the RIVM, for many years, and she has also been instrumental in setting up the first cohort of the European traineeship program for public health microbiologists, which is run by the ECDC many years later still. So Marion, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So context, as explained by Ines, is really very much of someone who studies viruses and viral disease outbreaks, and over the years what has become a central theme is what do we need to learn very fast at any new disease outbreak, and how do we translate that into evidence-based guidance. And that's really been how I'm involved in this. So it is, but it has been quite a ride. I have been reading about, for instance, the 1918 pandemic, and then you read also about the public unrest and the civil unrest, and it's understandable. And in pandemic planning, this came in, and then you say, okay, where do we hide the vaccines? How do we make sure that if there's of the security situation? But it's very different if you're experiencing this. So initially, the questions in the pandemic were quite the questions you would expect. So it's these key questions that you need answers to in any disease outbreak. And because I happen to have worked in this space for quite a while, I have been approached by many also in advisory roles, but also at the level of the media, to just explain what is this about, what do we need to know, what studies are needed, and how does that help control. And this is, I think, common to many of us in this. So then, it was a big difference when this was still, something happening in Asia. So all the information about the important preparedness networks that were out there, the key questions that were needed, the studies that you need, was still very distant for most of European organizations, I think, unfortunately. So it really was sort of beating the drum on this, but that was challenging. So then the first cases in Europe popped up, and that completely changed the situation, because all of a sudden there was a rapid awakening, not just for people who had been experiencing training for this at public health level, but now also all of a sudden the whole clinical arena, who had maybe trained for outbreaks, but not really to this level. And I remember also, for instance, when there was Ebola in West Africa, there was all of a sudden a massive need for training of clinical centers on how to protect if an infectious patient might walk in. And I've always found that amazing, because that could happen any day, not just when it's announced through WHO intelligence, for instance. But so here the question shifted a bit, and there was more of a unrest in. So how do we do this? What else is needed? How is this going to evolve? Are we going to get really a big wave? And why don't you know? So that became that phase. And then in that period, you also started to see what I think are healthy, hot debates. What are these critical questions? So these are key questions that we know are there. There is uncertainty in an early phase pandemic. It's not because a country like China, for instance, messes up. It's just because it's very difficult to know at the start of an outbreak or a pandemic, how severe is it? How is it transmitted exactly? What is the role of asymptomatic people? It's really difficult to know that. But this is also when the first, the great open science movement came in. But when that started to create massive debate, public debate, all sorts of experts commenting on papers that had not yet been peer-reviewed, that became sort of more and more challenging. A lot of debate, criticizing, healthy, but also quite disruptive. And when you're in the middle of trying to put up advisory with the people that have been preparing for this. So I'm sketching this because they all have the different aspects of the demand for public communication as a scientist. This is when the political angle came in. This was the first, of course, when accusations started about who really caused the pandemic, and when there was finger pointing to China at high-level political, including hinting at maybe this was not an accident of nature, but it was an accident of or even intentional lab work. I was very early on called into a meeting with Tony Fauci, Jeremy Farrar, to look at some analysis that was put together by scientists, in particularly Christian Andersen, to challenge this. What does this virus look like? Is there really evidence for tampering, which was the accusation of that time? And in that discussion, we really concluded all of this can be very easily explained by biology, and it has been published, but that has been an area of a lot of ongoing challenge and debate. Herd immunity, the joint shared term that as infectious disease specialists we understand and have talked about in the public, including myself, but which then sort of spun out of control as a goal of the government trying to infect everyone, many people dying, it's your fault, rather than a consequence of ongoing circulation, as many of us had been talking about it. It became a concept that really started a life of its own in our country. And scarcity and unavoidable choices that requires. There was just not enough for testing everyone right away. There was not enough PPE for everyone. So choices had to be made, and many people were angry about the exact choices because it really is difficult to explain them. And then there were really misconceptions and conspiracies. And I've personally been at the center of these. One was PCR Gate. Eurosurveillance has been targeted for that one too. And that's a sort of a conspiracy that says, how come this PCR protocol was already up and running before there were any cases in Europe? That cannot be possible. And the lack of acceptance is that you can do that when you have the genomic sequence and you have labs that have biological specimens from patients with SARS, MERS, and a lot of other respiratory diseases, so you can do initial validation even if you don't have patients. That has been and continues to be at the root of many court cases today. Fauci Gate, of course, because with a Public Freedom of Information Act request, the emails around our meeting were published but strike through with the principle there that there is in freedom of information scientific debate, discussion is exempt. So there's no secrets in those emails, but it is drawing a line of where freedom of information stops and what needs to be just intercollegial discussion, and what was shared was a publication. There's a conspiracy that says if it kills Erasmus, my institute will make it. That doesn't help. The anti-vaccine movement, quite strong in our country. These vaccines are gene therapy and not registered, and they kill people. And the China mission that I was part of to try and get at the origins of the pandemic, saying this was a fake, and it really the team was bought by China. So, and the consequences have been, and that's not something as a scientist you prepare for, is multiple lawsuits for which I get a lot of support from legal, high-level legal experts, which I had never prepared for, and I would not have had if they wouldn't do it. Accusations about my conflicts by being paid by China that really were circulated directly at political level from the US to our right-wing politicians requesting for me to be kicked out of every job that I have. Threats, a lot of libelous mails and newspaper articles. And the consequence is that we had to put enhanced security in place in wherever I go and around our house. And the impact on my family has been quite dramatic, and that's what really. So a lot of this is okay. It comes maybe part of it with a job, but the last point is what really pisses me off. Here's an example. This is flowers, but from a not so nice source. This was a thing. You can nominate people for the Mustard Award. Mustard was was the Dutch leader of the Dutch Nazi party, so you would get emails, congratulations, I nominate you for this award, every other day. So I have looked at that as, okay, so this is how a pandemic is. This is how a population under stress responds with all that diversity. A lot of it is good questions, good debate, things we really should be preparing for. But the dynamics also with the social media environment now can also become quite toxic. And I do think we need a discussion also among experts on how to deal with this in the future. And that includes the learned societies, because it is, I've talked to colleagues in other countries that have experienced similar things. I think there's also a role for our societies.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you also for leading over to the next topic, because the next speaker will change perspective. He will give us a broader picture of what it means for scientists to be in the limelight during a pandemic. And I understand Kai Kupferschmidt, who's a science journalist working for Science, and he has been awarded several prizes for his coverage of the pandemic, will take us through some personal experiences, but also share the results of 2 surveys which have been undertaken by both Nature and Science, and which painted a bit of a grim picture. So I hand the floor to Kai Kupferschmidt.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the invitation, first of all. Yeah, it is a change of perspective a little bit. I'm going to try and be fast because what I thought I'd do, so as a science journalist, I haven't had the experience that Marion or Anders have. But of course, when we talk about politicizing science, journalism plays a huge role there. And I decided that I'm going to tell you 3 very brief stories, examples from the pandemic that either touched on my personal work or had to do with journalism in a broader sense. And maybe it's a good jumping off point for questions afterwards. So let me start with a story that I actually wrote. So this is a story that I wrote on the 3rd of February 2020. A lot of you will probably remember there was a paper published in NEJM, I think on the 30th of January, which suggested that there was asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19. Of course, this was very, very early days. This was based on a cluster that happened in southern Germany. There was a Chinese businesswoman that had come to a company, and basically the paper investigated this cluster, and the title was something like, there's asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19, essentially. Now, when I looked at that paper, I started getting some comments on it, and then people who had also investigated the cluster pointed out that nobody had actually talked to the businesswoman. So while the paper said she had been asymptomatic when she transmitted it, that was based on the judgment of other people who had seen her. Nobody had actually reached the woman herself. And so at that point, I did what I normally do as a science journalist. I treated this as any other paper where scientists tell me we think this is flawed for these reasons. And so I wrote this article, which was called "Study Claiming New Coronavirus Can Be Transmitted by People Without Symptoms Was Flawed." And I mean, just to be very clear, the paper, of course, includes, I just highlighted a little thing here, it says the fact that the paper got it wrong doesn't mean transmission from asymptomatic people doesn't occur. And then I go on to quote Christian Drosten, who says that actually it's becoming very clear that at least people with very mild symptoms are transmitting it, and essentially these are people who are not going to stay home. But this story came out, it created a lot of attention, and then, of course, over time, the evidence changed, and it became very clear that it can be transmitted, that the virus can be transmitted by people with very few symptoms and sometimes even no symptoms. And I didn't really pay that much more attention to that story until in June, July of that year, it suddenly started, we suddenly got this spike in traffic to our website at Science. And people were looking up this story, like hundreds of thousands of people clicking on this story 6 months after it was published. And so we tried to find out where the traffic was coming from and why. And it became very clear, if you just take the link to the story, you paste it in Twitter and you look at who's tweeting it, it became clear that a lot of right-wing accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers and people associated with the Republican Party, anti-vaxxers, were tweeting this basically as an argument why it didn't make sense to wear masks. So the idea, of course, was if you're healthy, even if you feel healthy, you should be wearing a mask because you might be infected, you might be transmitting the virus, and so everybody should mask up. That's the idea of the mask mandate. And so people were just using this 5 months later after the evidence has changed. People were using this story and circulating it widely and saying, look, here's Science magazine showing there's no evidence and so we shouldn't be wearing masks. So we did something that I don't think we've ever done before at Science, at least I don't know that. So we put a note at the top of the story before you get to the main story. We put up this note saying, so you can see we put it up in June, this story has been cited widely on social media to argue against the use of face masks and shelter-in-place policies. This is based on a misreading of the article. The fact that the NEJM paper had a flaw does not mean asymptomatic transmission does not exist. This is still under discussion, but it is now well established that people with very mild symptoms can infect others and even spark large outbreaks of disease. So this, for me, I mean, I've written about infectious diseases for 12 years and, you know, a lot of times, of course, there's controversy and people can misread stuff. But this was really the first time that I felt that an article of mine was being specifically used by people who knew that this, wasn't the state of the art anymore. Science changes over the course of 5 months when the whole pandemic is only 6 months old. But people were using it and abusing it. And so I think this is the kind of thing that we probably in journalism also have to get used to do these kinds of things. There's of course, you can always argue, you can take down a story, but then you get into a whole other debate about censorship and people saying you're trying to change the record. So in a situation where the evidence is constantly changing, this becomes an interesting problem for journalism, how you deal with the fact that you have old stories out there which give a picture of the evidence that is simply not up to date anymore. And I think that's something that we have to think about. I want to give a completely different example. This is from Germany. This created a lot of controversy. This was in December 2021. This is taken from the Bild Zeitung, which is the biggest tabloid in Germany. And basically, the head, it says the lockdown makers. So the newspaper is accusing these 3 people that it's showing of being responsible for the lockdown over Christmas that was announced. These are Dirk Brockmann, Viola Priesemann, and Michael Meyer-Hermann, who were 3 scientists who were advising the German government. But of course, they weren't making policy, they weren't making decisions. They were 3 scientists giving their expert advice, and then the German government made its decision based on political considerations as well as scientific considerations, of course. And you can see it's quite cynical. Like they put in little presents, and it says, you have to, 2G means you have to be either vaccinated or wear a mask in order to go into shops to buy your presents. You have to, you can only celebrate with your family according to these corona rules. And so this created a lot of controversy in Germany because they were just specifically targeting 3 people and suggesting that they were responsible. The reason that I'm telling this story, what I found so interesting here was that it's the one example in the pandemic in Germany that I can think of where we got a coordinated response from the scientific community. So on the 6th of December, I think 2 days later, all of these organizations together, so there's the German Academic Exchange, the Max Planck Society, Helmholtz, all of these societies, these scientific societies got together and they published a statement on this, and I just very roughly translated a part of it in English. It says, the manner in which individual scientists are exhibited here and made personally responsible for necessary but unpopular measures to fight this pandemic is defamatory, and it can easily contribute to a climate that has already led to some scientists being threatened with physical violence. So this was an interesting example of scientists, organized science, pushing back against this kind of politicization. And like I said, it's pretty much the only one that I can remember. Maybe one more point. The whole controversy led to a meeting in the end of the editor-in-chief of Bild Zeitung with some of these scientists as well as some of the heads of the scientific organizations. You could watch that live online, it was streamed. You can argue about the outcome, but the editor-in-chief did say he was more than unhappy with that story and he wouldn't publish it again that way. At the same time, there was an official complaint lodged, well, hundreds of complaints actually were lodged with the German press council, but the German press council in the end decided that actually this particular headline was covered by freedom of speech and was within the realm of what responsible media can do. I don't agree with that, a lot of people don't agree with that, but that was the official decision. But the point is that the scientific societies, even before that, had already started a debate that made at least the editor-in-chief rethink this a little bit. And I was doing an interview a little bit after this. I was doing an interview with Mai Tin Kim, who's a very good science communicator in Germany. She does amazing work on YouTube and now on TV. And we talked about this particular example because we did the interview also in December. And she made a really important point, which I just wanted to share, because she said, while she believes that science has to be politically neutral, that paradoxically means that sometimes science actually has to be politically active to become political to defend that neutrality. Because if you're living in an environment where the media, the culture, the politics are all politicizing science, then just sitting back and not doing anything is not going to give you the neutrality or the freedom to do your science unencumbered. And so there's a paradox here, but I think it's one that the pandemic has made pretty clear and that I think needs a lot more attention and thought from the scientific community in general. One last point really quickly. So Ines mentioned I was going to talk about these surveys. Nature did a really nice survey I'm going to talk about the one that we did at Science, which reached a lot of the same conclusions. This wasn't done by me. It's from my brilliant colleague, Kathleen O'Grady. This was a recent story in Science in March. And basically, Kathleen sent out this questionnaire about scientists' experience in the pandemic to, I think, more than 9,000 researchers who had published on COVID-19. And she got responses from about 500. You really should read the piece. It's really, really good. And the whole methodology of the survey is in there. But I just wanted to highlight really quickly what the experience has been for some people in science in this pandemic, given also what the German society said about this leading to physical violence. So this is maybe the main result here, is that out of the 510 respondents, 38% of these researchers reported some type of harassment. You can see here it ranges from personal insults all the way to physical intimidation, vandalism, threats of harm directed at family. The story actually opens with an experience that Marion had at a museum, I think, when she was visiting with her family, and the staff had to close the doors to make sure she was safe. This is something I find really interesting. It's also from the survey. It looks a little bit at the kind of debates. This goes a little bit with what Marion was saying about the debates she was involved in. So you can see that there's some types of subtypes of views that get people especially riled up, apparently. Certainly on Twitter, I can attest to the fact that the ivermectin crowd has just been insane. I'm sorry. It's just, I mean, you know, there's so much evidence at this point. There's such an evidence base. It's just people get so upset. People really buy into certain things, and that's the part of the politicization, I think, polarization. That's sometimes hard to understand. And I think there's a lot of science that also needs to be done to understand it. And just, I won't go through this. I just wanted to show you there's more results in the survey, including looking a little bit at the toll that this has taken and how people cope with it, including, you know, all the way from leaving social media to leaving their job. So this has taken a really big toll. I want to make one thing very clear. These three stories that I just kind of hinted at, I just wanted to give you kind of like a spectrum of things to think about. I think these are symptoms. I do not think that this somehow happened in this pandemic. I do not think that this is new. I think that we live in a climate that encourages polarization and politicization. It suffuses everything. It suffuses our media, certainly our social media. It suffuses our politics, our culture. It's just a motor that drives a lot of the way that we work and talk and are in this society. And so I don't think that it is something that we can address only within the community of science or scientists or even public health scientists. I think there is stuff that certainly we can do and that maybe we'll get to talk about. But I also think one of the big lessons for me here is that understanding science as an integral part of society that is sooner or later always going to be affected by the same trends that are already affecting a lot of other parts of society is just something that sometimes scientists that I talk to have a hard time accepting, I think. I think science sometimes is isolated a little bit from some of these trends, but certainly what we're seeing right now is these societal trends completely suffusing also the scientific debates. And scientists themselves, if I look at how people communicated on Twitter at the beginning of the pandemic and how they're communicating now, individuals that I can look at because I've been following them for 2 years, this does something to us as people being on social media, the way that we interact. It's very hard to stay always calm and balanced and not at some point, you know, fall into that trap of becoming polarized and politicized yourself. And I think that's also something that needs a lot more attention and probably just training and experience maybe. So I'll stop it there. I just wanted to open up these topics for debate, and then, yeah, Ines, maybe.
Thank you very much, Kai. I think what we're doing next is we stand a bit apart here, and we have everyone here for your questions. So please, if you have questions for any of the speakers, please use the microphone and share your own experiences, share your ideas, comment. You're welcome now. Anyone in the audience who would like to make a comment?
Hi, Albert Mifsud. I work in London. I'm a consultant microbiologist. Have been employed by public health authorities as well as in the NHS for a long time. I've been fascinated by what you say, and I hadn't realized the extent of the abuse that you've suffered. And in a way, I wonder if this should be called a form of terrorism rather than politicization. Because I kind of have been reading the media and looking at what's been happening in the country where I work, and have done for 4 decades. And have been saying, I've also seen politicization in a different way, where many scientists have seem to have nailed their mask to particular political viewpoints. Not actively so, but it's, at least in our country, I'm sure it's the same in many others. You know, the government takes a particular viewpoint, and the opposition party takes an opposing viewpoint, and then another party takes another one, and we're kind of ratcheting up. To the extent I've noticed that, I mean, you may like it, you may dislike it. I mean, a number of eminent scientists have engaged in some, you know, we've been around for over a year, 2 years, the Great Barrington Declaration. Within the scientific group, those who who've seen some sense in it, rightly or wrongly, have also been derided by other scientists, which I think is sad. And the reason why I come from this perspective, having seen hundreds of COVID patients, dozens of whom, if not more, died, and having suffered from the disease myself, I also know that the impact this had on my family. One of my daughters, she's just graduated now, she was in university. She knows, thank not closely, 3 of her classmates committed suicide in the last 2 years. Her own flatmate, while she was in lockdown in London with us at home, her flatmate she was a student in St Andrews in Scotland, was in home in Hull, and spent an hour and a half or 2 hours on the phone one Sunday early hours at 2 in the morning, because he too was on the verge of committing suicide. And I fear and I feel that my reading, and I may be wrong, that many of our scientists have been focusing, we must bring COVID down to as close to zero as possible. I mean, as the months and years gone by, we realize it can't be done, at the expense of everything else. And therefore, I kind of personally feel that many scientists therefore politicize themselves by neglecting to appreciate, or neglecting to publicly appreciate, or make it clear that there have been big prices paid. Just a comment, and I welcome any thoughts from colleagues.
Well, I think this is a very important aspect, but also I struggle with, because if in a scientific advisory role, which I've been in an advisory role in the National Outbreak Management Team, I'm there because of my expertise in virology and in epidemiology and in transmission, etc. So that's what I try to stick to. I very much see the broader impact, but there's also something that came up in the discussion after after Chikwe's lecture, that it's very difficult because there's no similar databases or knowledge basis for what is the mental impact. How do you gauge, how do you weigh one versus the other? Certainly not in times when decisions need to be made a couple of times a week because of a very rapidly evolving situation. And I think it's something we miss. It's not like, so I have very similar stories in my direct environment, but that's not what I am called for to the advisory table. So it's very difficult to do, where does that stop, and how do you take that into account?
Sorry. Maybe just one really brief point, because you said some people, like, I agree to some extent that there is a sense that scientists, after 2 years in the pandemic, have become convinced of certain viewpoints. And I feel in the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was looking at every piece of evidence and really being open to interpreting it one way or the other and looking at it. And now a lot of times there's a reflex. Once people have decided, okay, this is really terrible and we don't worry enough about the kids, or, you know, we should really get down to zero or whatever, they interpret everything that way. And it's a bit like, I think we have to realize that, for instance, at least the scientists on social media does that to you. If you have 80,000 followers and they expect you to always say, but the kids, and then, you know, you get applause for that. Like it it's very hard to not fall into the trap of this kind of like bias. And I think that is something I was surprised by it, because I think all of us as scientists are kind of trained in trying to be aware of our own biases, but I just realized in this pandemic that it becomes so overwhelming. The emotion of people, the force of people's expectations of what they want you to say is so strong that it is very, very hard to stay out of that. But that's kind of a side point. I agree with Marion that one of the problems is that the data here is very complicated, and we are constantly weighing unknowns in this pandemic. What are the future? I mean, look at what's happening with hepatitis cases. We don't really know, but yeah, there's a possibility that there are unintended side effects of the lockdown. There's a possibility that the virus itself is having unintended or unexpected late-term consequences, right? So all of these things, it's just incredibly hard to weigh them. I'm happy that I don't have the job of weighing them.
But I would like to come back that we need to do it. If it's done in academia, if it's done on political level or an agency level, it doesn't really matter. That will be different in different contexts, but it's definitely needed. And I think it's something we need to learn into the future. But you're also touching on one aspect which has been very clear in Sweden, that the dialogue, the discussion between scientists has also been, I would almost say, brutalized. Normally, I think we could talk to each other in a fairly civilized manner and agree on that we have different opinions about things, but it's gone far beyond that in a number of occasions. And I think that the scientists I know in Sweden that did step down because of other scientists that attacked them so much, not because of social media or anything like that. So it's done a lot of things to us in many ways, unfortunately.
Am I allowed to ask one more question? Okay, hi. I'm Pari Shamsrizi. I'm from Hamburg, Germany, and I'm working half-time as a doctor in infection research and also as a postdoctoral researcher in health communication. For Cornelia Beach, that you probably know. And so my experience the last 2 years working really in the COVID department was that I had the feeling a lot of scientists cannot say, maybe I'm wrong, but cannot say, sorry, this is not my field. So for example, my chief, Marilyn Addo, who is an infectious disease doctor, she sometimes in interviews says, when she's getting to ask like an epidemiology questions, she says, maybe you should ask that the epidemiologist expert. And I have the feeling this got a bit lost, especially in Germany, where there are a lot of talking rounds in the evening on TV, and everyone is an expert, even though they are not for that for that field. So my question was, what is your opinion? Do you think in other countries is the same as in Germany? Is it a cultural thing? That was something I'm interested in.
I can start and say it's exactly the same in Sweden. I mean, media says professor's opinion is this or that, and nobody, unfortunately, media is not very good at then looking at what does is the professor really a professor in? What does this person know or not know? And I think it's become a phenomenon, and it's interesting. We're seeing the exact same phenomena now when we're coming to Ukraine. Suddenly we have experts who nobody ever heard about before, who's making very bold statements about why the Russian army is doing this or that. And so I don't know if this is a new change or if it's something that we had, but it's just became much more clear now.
I just want to make the point that I think there's two things exacerbating each other here, right? I agree with you, some scientists are actually very good at pointing out what they don't know. But of course, if a talk show calls them and they say, oh, I can't talk about this, they're going to keep calling people until they find someone who says they're going to, and I've had this experience. People call me up and want me to sit on a talk show and I say I can't talk about it, and they find the next person who can't talk about it but is willing to go. And sometimes I watch it and I'm like, it doesn't make sense, right? So these are problems, but we also get into this problem because I think sometimes, because you said experts that no one knew before, like what I find so fascinating is that we end up, when we talk about this, we end up being very kind of unscientific in the sense that we say, oh, but what's he a professor for? I mean, we're really arguing by authority in a way. When on some level, of course, we have to be arguing by, but it gets so complex, and I think the problem is that a talk show is never going to go through the actual arguments. So the only thing you do is you choose the right expert, and then whatever he says is seen as an expert opinion. And that's just a limitation of this. It's why I tend to say no to talk shows, because I find them incredibly frustrating. Radio, like, I think Christian Drosten was incredibly smart by early on realizing that if he does a 1-hour podcast, a few times a week, that gives him the room to really say I don't know, to really give context and all these things. And I think that's the kind of media savvy that we also need maybe in scientists. But in general, I think we do have a media problem here as well. I think talk shows simply are very, very bad unless they choose the people really wisely at informing the public.
Yeah, I think I think we shouldn't be arrogant about who is the expert, but on the other hand, some of the really, really strong conspiracy pushers are so-called experts. They have published. They are so. It is also a valid question at some point. Plus, in my experience with talk shows, you can actually say, well, what is it actually that you want me to discuss? Who else will be there? So there is an influence. You can really say, well, no, because it's more fun if you put you up in a pro-con, and if that's done with, a conspiracist, then you put that on equal footing, and then I think that's dangerous. So I think there's also a bit about media savviness. On the other hand, there's also, I have experienced a very open program that said, okay, we see all this PCR stuff flying around, can you just explain it in a longer podcast that was? What happened was, 30 seconds was pulled out, and that went viral globally, with me admitting the PCR was wrong, which I didn't do. So it's also very difficult to manage what gets done with whatever you say in public.
Thank you.
I agree, and we have one more question. I just wanted to also say, when it comes to political stance and political statements, public health is about policy. It's about changing the environment, and it's about being an agent for those who need it. So we cannot fully stay away from taking a stance at some point when we are working in the field of public health. So that's also the dilemma that you mentioned also by your colleague that had the podcast, that we have both. We have the role of providing evidence which is as sound as can be and which can be scrutinized. At the same point, there is a right to interpret this evidence as you see fit, with all the limitations and with the acceptance that someone else can scrutinize the evidence or can use the same data and interpret it differently. But you have to be very clear about why you interpret the data the way you do it. And that's not for everyone who's not a scientist to be able to judge on this. And this is where the dilemma starts and where maybe scientists need training. But we have another question.
Doug Hagstrom, expert in nothing. But my question is, how do we actually move forward into integrative science, or what it would be called? Because it's even beyond public health. It's not just that, it's about how do we bring science into political decision-making in the right way? And yeah, I don't know what it is, but like, if you call it integrative science, how can we move forward?
I think, once again, you need to come back to the context where you live in and work with that. Because this is what I've learned from in Sweden is very much about trust. Not only trust from the public, but also trust between, if it's an agency or if it's a university or whatever, it doesn't really matter, but trust between them and the politicians. I think that's what we really felt in Sweden. We had a long-term relation with our political masters, and there was a lot of trust. And I think that's, you need to do that. As many things when it comes to prevention, you need to work long term. You need to build up that trust so that you, even in a period of crisis, your political masters will feel safe in following your advice. And you need to be very clear about that this advice is as good as it gets right now. It might change. But I think you need to build up that. It cannot start during a crisis.
I think it's an extremely difficult, but it's something that needs to be built during peacetime. There was a presentation on the WHO pandemic hub that I think has, a good vision there, in that it needs to somehow be an ecosystem for people to collaborate, which you then can challenge with doing like outbreak simulations or things, because it's so we are trying that also in our country, bringing people that think about climate effects on sea level rise and the landscaping, and how, and then we bring in, well, how does that affect arbovirus infections, risk of zoonotic virus infections, and it's very interesting because these are all top-level experts, but have never thought about this. I have never thought about that the landscaping that our colleagues at the Technical University do could actually impact the risk of disease emergence. So by trying to see what it is that you can bring together and looking at this as a more ecosystem type approach, at least that's a step that I think will be needed.
Maybe just one point. I mean, it's going to take time, and I think certainly at this point, anybody who studies science, anybody who teaches science, there needs to be a track there, not just about communicating science, because I think communicating science still, whenever I talk to people, seems to be thought of very much as a one-way street, but it's a question of science. What role does science play in democracy? What role does science play in the society that it is serving, essentially? And I think that is something that's gotten a little bit lost sometimes. Mostly this is, research funded by taxpayers that has, that society is encouraging for a certain reason, and there needs to be a strong link. If you think of politics, science, and the public as kind of like a triangle, there's a lot of trust and transparency that is needed, and I think what science right now can do is to really try and go out and try and think about its role in society, because I think that's sometimes missing. That's my very personal opinion here.
We can take one more question and that will be the last.
Okay, thank you. Achim Kasch, Magdeburg. I'm a clinical microbiologist and started a new job as a head of a department in right with the pandemic, and experienced it on many levels, from advising local and regional authorities to doing the diagnostics and doing research. And I found many of the problems that we've been talking about here as well. But I want to just extend what Kai Kupferschmidt was saying. I think as scientists we need an understanding on how politics work. And this is something that's, at least I did not have. And I sort of had to learn how that works and how you're not used for other interests, how you keep away from that. It's not easy sometimes, and sometimes it makes sense to actually leverage politics to get things done that need to be done. And so I would appreciate your input on how you see this. Do we need like a politics introduced into the scientific career paths as lessons to be learned?
I think yes, but very carefully. Because I think the element that you mentioned, you have to understand how the political arena works to understand how to shape your advice. I think that's important. But I also think it's extremely important to stay on the neutral side. Although that what Carl just mentioned in the in our country, we had an election in the middle of the pandemic, and what you really could see is that specific elements of the scientific advice or the advice on the recommendations for the policy advice, they were picked up by different parties and were made part of the election dynamic, rhetoric. And that's when it really becomes very difficult. And that's when I think you really have to stay out as a scientist, because that is clearly politics. It's no longer about the science. But it does impact on what gets done with whatever advice we put out. And the border there, the limit there, is something that I'm now occasionally stepping over, is the extreme right agenda, because that is an active pushing of scientific misinformation, undermining and targeting scientists, and that's where I do think we have to draw a line. But it's also very difficult where that line is, how to recognize it, but I do think that's something that needs to be figured out.
I think one thing that helps is to really build structures, and I think Germany actually has a very bad scientific advice structure, or not very clear one. Of course, this is very ironic. I mean, the UK has a very good, transparent structure, but they had terrible pandemic policy in the end, right? That's also something you have to accept. You can have the best structure for scientific advice and even the best scientific advice, and you can have the worst possible prime minister doing the shittiest policies. It's just, that's, there's stuff that you can change and stuff you can't change. But I do think in general, when we're talking now a lot about training people, and I think that's important, but of course a lot of people are coming out of this pandemic with a lot of experience. I think what we need to do is translate this experience into structures that transcend the people, so that when these people are gone or retired or dead, we still have structures that are built on the lessons of this pandemic. And this is something like that really frustrates me, because when we talk about the lessons of the pandemic, so often we're talking about personal growth or personal lessons, when really what we need is to translate that into structures that stay. And that's, I think, where a lot of energy will be needed, especially as the memory of this pandemic recedes a little bit. That's going to take a lot of push from people, a lot of energy to actually make this happen. And I'm not sure that it's going to happen at the moment, but I certainly hope it will, because we will be in the next pandemic, and I hope we're better prepared next time for this.
No, I couldn't agree more. Building structures is what it's all about, and when the structures are there, you need to also to be able to understand them. So I think I'm coming back to my previous comment on how important it is to build this in peacetime. And it's not only teaching the politicians to understand science, it's also teaching the scientists to understand policy and politics. And I think it really needs to go both ways to be workable.
Okay, with this I would like to conclude this session. Obviously, we're all aligned that the voice of science is important. It's important also in a political climate. However, at the same time, we need the engagement from those who are the recipients of evidence-based recommendations, and we need those to come together. We need to understand, as Anders said, how scientists need to learn and how politicians need to learn. And the media probably also has to learn in how far they can influence in a positive or in a very negative way what is going to happen. So with this, I would like to thank you all, and maybe we can give a big round of applause to the three speakers, and you hope you will enjoy the conference.